Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for joining us. As you can see on the screen, we have a couple of things to keep in mind before we really get started with tonight's town hall about the future of safety and what do we mean by abolish and defund. We are probably going to get going here at about 5 minutes after 6 to give other persons who had registered an opportunity to join so we don't have to backtrack. Again, we thank you for spending time with us this evening. We're super excited about our panelists. We will, like I said, get going here in about 5 minutes after 6. Please remain muted so that we don't pick up on anyone's background noise based on where you might be located this evening, and more to come. So just please hang with us.
Test, test, test.
Hey, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get going. We're about 5 minutes after 6. So before we get started with Grace introducing our panelists for the night, we want to acknowledge that one of our panelists that we had scheduled from Reclaim the Block fell ill and is unable to join us. So we're not able to have that particular voice into the room. However, they did provide as an organization a video, some content that they use to describe what they think about trying to help level set the ideas between reform, defund, and abolish. So we will be able to share that after our panelists who are actually with us tonight begin to share their views. again, just as a reminder, we're going to make sure that we keep this space very respectful in terms of tone and our actions and how we interact with one another. It is our desire not to remove anyone from this meeting, and that means we can certainly disagree, but it's just about how we disagree. We really encourage you to, if you have questions for the panelists, to place them in the chat. If you have comments that you want to share, to place them in the chat. Those are 100% welcomed. And again, we appreciate you being here. Tonight is not about the association or any participant lifting up, and I shouldn't say that, it's not about PP&A specifically, lifting up anyone view about the value of defunding or reforming or abolishing. We are trying to hold a series that we're pretty excited about to really just act as a way to help increase people's awareness about what we mean as a community about some of these ideas that's really beginning to influence the conversations around the future of policing in Minneapolis and really around the country. So with that, I won't say any more. I'll ask Grace to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and we'll get going for the evening.
Excellent. Thanks, Tabitha. So again, I'm really excited to welcome our panelists tonight. Our first panelist this evening is Janelle Austin. Janelle has been volunteering and caring for the George Floyd Memorial. She lives in the neighborhood, and she's the founder of the Racial Agency Initiative, so we're really excited to hear from her. And our other panelist is Carmen Means, who is the Executive Director at the Central Area Neighborhood Development Organization, CANDO. So we're really excited to hear from both of them, and really, like Tabitha mentioned, bummed that our Reclaim the Block panelists couldn't join, but excited to share the video with you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Janelle to take about 5 minutes to introduce herself and her work, and then we'll pass it to Carmen and then go from there. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, my name is Janelle Austin, and I live technically in Bryant neighborhood. I'm over on 38th in Oakland, and this summer I have kind of been evolved into the capacity of lead caretaker for the George Floyd Memorial. Started early on in May. In June, picking up garbage and tending to the memorial for my own self-care. And that was just a very important process for me in terms of how I were to sustain myself in engaging protest this summer. And a lot of the work has evolved over time, and we are tending to every offering that has been laid at the memorial, and with the help of the Midwest Arts Conservation Center, providing guidance on site and how to conserve the offerings is a lot of the work. And we have about a team of 18 community members who also serve and help and tend to the memorial as well. When I'm not doing that, I do own my own company called Racial Agency Initiative, where I do racial justice leadership coaching. I work with people to leverage their agency for racial justice, really focusing on pursuing racial justice with joy. And with that concept, it's really about leveraging our strengths, leveraging the things that give us life to actually help move the needle of racial justice forward. So that way we're not reaching burnout too fast or too quickly in this process of achieving racial justice together in society. So I don't think that is 5 minutes worth of time, but I'm gonna pause and stop there and pass the mic to Ms. Carmen.
Thanks, Jen.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Carmen Means. I have the pleasure and honor of being the executive director of Central Neighborhood as well as Bryant Neighborhood. I've been in my position a little bit over a year. And so the work that I've been doing during the uprising, of course, none of us planned for this, but prior to my work with Bryant and Central and Bryant rather, I was definitely deeply involved with social justice work, work for ADOS, African Descendants of Slaves, and really pushing towards what liberation looks like and being able to live that out in tangible ways. And so after the murder of George Floyd, absolutely that spiraled my pre-work, and I'm gonna say even my current work, in such a way that I could have never have imagined. I lead a very amazing team. I could not do this without them. And so our job in our space and our place has been, number one, to be ears of the community, to be hearers what the community is saying, what they need, how do we show up? And so not only for the community as it pertains to 38th, but for Black bodies all throughout in which we are connected to. So our loyalty, the focus may be to 38th Street, but our loyalty is really so that this will not happen anywhere. So we use 38th Street as a seed ground to sow seeds of planning of what justice looks like so that this work can surpass 38th in Chicago. With that as well, in this work, not only do I have an amazing team, colleagues such as Tabitha, Alicia Smith, also of Corcoran. We lead shoulder to shoulder, side by side. Their strength, of course, pours to mine and likewise. And so with that, just sharing the space, figuring out how to show up, showing up as a teacher in some spaces, but never not showing up as a student. That's the way that we always live out with team and with staff as well. And so our heartbeat is really to see, again, how do we plant seeds in Central neighborhood in this space, which has been stewarded to us, so that the lynching in which we all witnessed on May 24th and after with the brother in Atlanta would never happen again. So that's our space. That's the space that we hold. And so, yeah, I did a lot of meaning that I'm kind of nervous, but I don't get nervous. I do. But nevertheless, thank you all for joining. I look forward to having this conversation with you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm gonna queue up this video here, and hopefully everybody will be able to hear. So if you can't hear, somebody please let me know right away so that I can fix that and not waste everyone's time.
All right, baby, I think it's super important that we differentiate between abolishing, defunding, and reforming the police. Regardless of which action you support, let's just start by saying what we mean and not conflating ideas to make it more palatable. Let's start.
Hey everyone, sorry about the challenges with Zoom or with YouTube there. I'll just get a link of this video and post for people to watch.
Lowering the budget and
Thank you, Grace. So what we'll do then, instead of being able to share the video, again, that Reclaim the Block representatives provided, which is an attempt to provide one perspective about how to define the difference between people who believe in reform versus abolish or defunding the police. Grace has just dropped that particular video into the link, into the chat, excuse me, as a place of reference. So please refer to that. What I'm going to do now is just go ahead and begin to ask our panelists some questions. And then again, we will keep in mind that this is really going to be about community asking questions or providing their point of view about what the differences are for them with respect to defunding or abolish or reforming the police department as a part of our overall livability and safety construct in the city of Minneapolis. But before we do that, meaning lift up some of the questions or comments that people who have joined us tonight have, we're going to first engage our panelists with a couple of questions, so just bear with us. And really, I'm going to ask that maybe we start with Carmen. So Carmen, the first question really is about, so considering what we understand right now as a part of this dialogue about defunding or abolishing the police, what type of activities or strategies do you believe would support that work? And if you would like to take an opportunity for yourself to clarify what you think the differences are between defunding and those who believe that abolishing is important.
All right, so the first question, Tabitha, one more time, please.
Oh, absolutely. So from your perspective, what type of activities or strategies do you think really speak to these ideas of either, you can take both or one or the other, defunding or abolishing the police? So we throw that out there, but what does it look like to defund the police? What does it look like or mean to abolish the police? And I also asked, do you want to share your personal definition about what you think the difference is? Like, what is the difference for you as a community leader when you hear language like defund the police versus abolish the police?
Well, first and foremost, I think one of the strategies that has to be done in any community when you're talking about doing something as radical, as revolutionary, even both of those worlds we have not yet lived in. So both of those spaces are very radical, very revolutionary in thought. And I think it starts with the fundamental of what we just witnessed, what was attempted just a few minutes ago, the clearly defining of what that means. I think a lot of the fears that I'm running into is not only the inability to imagine a world without policing the way in which we have experienced it now, but also just the lack of definition, the lack of conversation, the lack of circles just as this. Not really here to persuade either way, but just to bring clarity, to be able to build a space for conversations such as this to happen. I don't think that this should be a far in between space that is held, and definitely not putting all the weight on PPNA, but really strongly encouraging anyone that has the opportunity and that's been granted the opportunity to steward this moment in leading people and leading from any area, whether you reside in the George Floyd 55407 area, Powderhorn, Central, Can-Do, B&O, and so forth. How do we have this conversation about imagining a new world around abolishing, around defunding, around reformation? And so those conversations literally has to be very intentional about being intergenerational, about being very diverse, not just diverse in melanin, but diverse in opinions, diverse in age, in background. So the diversity is very broad in which we have this conversation. For those that are able to make that move as far as voting is concerned, but even our youth, what are the voices of the youth and what is the thought around that? And I believe in those circles, we're able to discover new truths, to possibly put out some fires and some fears that are birthed. And because of that fear is birth, we then begin to make decisions or even speak in spaces that would only keep us in a comfortable place in what we know right now, which comfortability for us have been very detrimental to our existence. Personally, what I just believe I've had this conversation with my mom, of course. My mother is 62 years old. I'm 43. She will tell you in a minute that what is going on now cannot continue. That is a non-negotiable for her. My mother's a Black woman. And she'll tell me again, Carmen, we've seen this. My mother, we are originally from Chicago. So we've seen this. One of the reasons why we left is because of things such as this, along with other factors as well that hit our community in a very harmful way. Nevertheless, the clarity is clear that we cannot continue life as we are right now. However, how do we continue life, period? And so with that, the conversation comes up about abolishing. Abolishing for me means to totally get rid of, but it also requires a whole new dreaming of what does accountability look like? What does community look like? You can't get rid of something without dreaming up something new. What does it look like to have a non-policing community? That is unheard of in my years, in my mother's years as well. And so the whole defunding, it is the reallocation of funds. What we've seen very clear in the square is that we know can be done, and it is not perfect. Let's be clear about that. There are some challenges that we are yet facing. But what we have seen during this time is an uprise that surpasses just protesting. It's an uprise in building community. People are coming off their porches. They're getting involved. They're getting engaged. Be that as it may, from whatever angle that they're coming from, we're all of a sudden beginning to see the power of community in very real ways. And I think that we can be able to dream that out more with using routes such as defunding. And whether we know it or not, defunding is the toddler child of abolishing. People don't want to really have that, but that is really a step to what abolishing could look like. So being able to dream up that, being able to stand on that, and being able to not hoard that moment, but being open to allow people that are able to dream past what you have the capacity of dreaming and believing, and allowing that to happen. Understanding that leadership, it surpasses what I look like and what I dream of, but there's people that are able to dream past what I can imagine, what this new community looks like.
Thank you, Carmen. So Janelle, what I'm going to ask you to do too is maybe start from where Carmen left off, is if you could share from your perspective first, what it means when you hear the word defunding of police. And then for you personally and in your work, what do you think about when you hear the terminology, term abolishing the police? And then if you want to take an opportunity to then circle back on that other question around what type of activities specifically, right, would it mean to include to defund or abolish?
Thank you, Tabitha, and thank you, Carmen. I feel that Carmen framed this very well in terms of defunding the police actually being a step toward abolishing the police, because of the way in which we're moving away from a current system, and helps us set our imagination for what is possible. And right now, because we've only known a world with policing, it's hard to actually get to that place. I like to say to have a PBS imagination, to be able to imagine the things that we don't see. But that is going to be critical and necessary for us as a community, regardless of what happens with the police. Because what we are asking ourselves to do is a kind of community accountability to say, are we accountable to our neighbor? And are we accountable to helping the people across the street or the people 2 blocks down rise together? If a kid does something wrong or inappropriate, is the best response for him to or her to go to juvie? Or is the best response for him or her to be accountable to their neighbors and whatever harm that they may have caused in the wrong that they did? What does it look like to stop outsourcing the responsibility of justice to a police department and actually taking that back into our responsibility as a community? And it's so important in terms of what Carmen mentioned about building community in the square right now, is people know each other's names, people know each other's faces of those who show up, and it has allowed us to be able to start seeing and building and feeling what is it like, and what is the possibility for us to actually hold each other accountable to do justice. I define justice as the process of working towards making something right. And so if we're demanding justice, it's not about someone gives us something and then it's all over, but it's an ongoing process of practicing justice as a community. What does it mean for us to be perfecting ourselves as we go? So when it comes to the police, for me, defunding the police simply means that we have to, as taxpayers, we are requesting to reduce the amount of money that goes into the police department, because if they say that they are not capable of responding to certain calls or cases that they receive, if they're not equipped to do that, then there must be other services, other people, other opportunities that can actually respond to those circumstances and situations in a healthier way that will keep us alive. And so then, what does it mean to take funding out of the police department, where we would normally expect the police to respond well to those moments, and shift those funds to other kinds of services or other kinds of organizations that can actually respond to those emergency calls in a way that promotes health and wellness for the whole of the community. With Abolish the Police, so I think for me there, what's so important is understanding the history of policing, and that it really comes out of the concept of slave patrol. So when you're thinking of a community being policed and over-policed and patrolled and over-patrolled, it's that concept of, we got to keep you in line. Like, this is our job, to keep you in line. What does that actually say about how the systems think about and treat people of color, who are often the most over-policed and over-patrolled communities? What does that say about what we believe about each other as neighbors? How do we think about that? I recently received an email from a neighbor that was concerned about a bunch of vehicles going down the street and potentially being gang members. And I replied back and I was like, yes, one of their community members had died, and that was a funeral procession. So what does it look like when we look at Black and brown people and we fear them before we allow them to actually express the fullness of their humanity? And so if policing actually reinforces our fears of Black and brown communities, that's not a healthy kind of law enforcement. Yes, there will be laws, and yes, those laws need to be enforced, but there has to be other ways in which that those systems of keeping each other accountable are not reinforcing these systemic systems of white supremacy, these systemic systems that oppress Black and brown communities. If we are going to come together in community, we have to do that in a way that it services everybody and not just us. So if I feel safe and I feel good to call the police, that's not good enough. My neighbor also has to feel safe, and also has to feel like that whomever we call for help and safety, that person is not going to show up and cause more harm to their body than help. So it really is about thinking about other folks. Kind of like when we talk about wearing a mask. I wish I had one right next to me. Oh, I do have one. Here we go. I wear a mask not to protect myself. I wear a mask to protect you. And that is a kind of community engagement, I think, that we're struggling with in America, or some are struggling with. Folks will say, I can't breathe, but it's like, what are we willing to give up so that way we protect our neighbor? What are we willing to sacrifice in terms of our own comfort so that everybody can be healthy when we're looking at wellness and community health and rising together? For me, and much like what Carmen said, the imagination around what would need to happen for either defunding or abolishing the police, it really is building community. It really is knowing each other's names, knowing each other's children, and beyond our block. I think sometimes we can grow up on a block and don't know anybody except those who are on our block. But what happens when we actually start to venture out and participate in neighborhood organization meetings, or go across the street to another neighborhood and see what they're up to? Building relationships so that we can begin experimenting again of what it means to be accountable to one another. That is not new. That we know. Cultures around the world have done that for centuries. So what does that mean to go back to a kind of healthy community accountability, but for many of us, learning it for the first time?
Thank you both. So one of my, not maybe last, but second to last questions for you both. It's a multi-parter before we kind of open it up to if people who have joined us tonight have questions, but it's twofold. The first is about, given what you've both shared in terms of the idea or the definitions, your understanding of defunding and abolish, if you can help from your point of view explain how much time, right, from the idea of how long does it take to move toward the process of defunding police actions, given what you both have shared in terms of has been a part of what we all currently know as community, meaning the police is a part of the community structure and construct, how much time do you think it could take or likely would take to either demonstrate a willingness to shift resources through a defund model, or what it seems like you're saying is abolish is far off beyond defunding? So the first question is really around how much time does it take to do that? And then in the midst of, if that were to happen, either defunding or abolishing, what happens in the meantime, right? What do you think are systems that need to either be in place through government structures or even communal structures if we're working toward, right, this idea or this new vision of fewer resources for police that might lead to abolish, or fewer resources for police that definitely does lead to abolishing? So the first part is around how much time does this whole thing take? The second question is around really, what do we do in the meantime when we all know that in the community there's things happening that make people feel less safe or make the community feel less livable, whether it's gun violence, sex trafficking, what I would call domestic violence, regardless of who is afflicting the pain, those type of things that's happening. How can we help the community think through what happens in the interim? Because we are so wired to currently contact police officers to deal with any one of those realities.
Well, I think the time question is a very, that's a sticky question, because the sad part is we really don't have time, if you will, but nevertheless, we need time. A lot of the things that we see and that we are experiencing right now is because we have moved so expedient to just in a world moving without thought, moving without humanity in mind. It produced the systems now that we have to undo and unravel and redo. Certain systems are not even worth dismantling. New systems need to be built, hence abolishing. And so with that, when we're talking about the whole time structure, I am not aware if there is a time structure out there. I believe that we are in the most crucial time now because we know that we cannot go back, but we are clear that we have to go forward and go forward with something new. That something new will take time because healing takes time. And I think one thing that we have been very great at doing is masking the true underlying illnesses that we have allowed to go on as a society. And when I say we, I'm speaking only in communal terms. I understand there's white supremacy, I understand there's systems that be, but for the sake of conversation of communal, I'm gonna use the word we. When those things are allowed to happen continually, when the pressure hits, as we've seen happen in our community right now, such things can only be quiet for so long because pain hurts and pain requires a response. What we see right now is something that we have to be very, very clear on, that it's not going to be an overnight, how you doing, brother? It's not going to be an overnight experience. This is not an experiment. Too long that we've allowed, or resources from the powers that be. One of the things that I remember very clearly when Reagan was in office, I was a little girl, and I remember the impact and the aftermath, and I still hear almost the PSTD that came from his reignship, from him being the president. Different things that we needed as a community, that it wasn't just a want as a community. It wasn't just a want as a community. These are things that we needed, and those things were stripped away and raped away from us. And we are still eating that dust and still reaping those lack of benefits, if you will. And so the time that we need will be the time in healing for us to prepare. And the crazy part, Tab, is this right here, is because we are in this space and we find ourselves in this moment, we almost have to move with both hands, through the left and the right, the dominant and the less dominant. We have to tear down and build up at the same time. And the rebuilding is the space that our people cannot wait again, because I don't know how much more we can take. I don't know how much more harm we can do. that we can see and experience. Breonna Taylor, for me, literally is on my chest. I'm breathing differently. I'm moving differently. So the timing, I will say, is now. The strategy is now as well. But the reality of it is, it's going to take time. So I too ask, what does time look like? When will this become part of our imagination? One of the fundamental of faith, and I'm not even speaking from a certain persuasion of a way to believe. One of the foundation of faith is imagination. And so when we are in a place, in a space again, that we captivate as our own, that we're not asking for permission to be, but we are living in a space of imagining something so new that we've never experienced. That is hard to do when you are still in a place of experiencing trauma. It's hard to imagine something new. You're telling me there's a better way, but yet and still I'm being inflicted constantly with the old. And I want to make sure that I move to the second question. I want to hear from the people as well. What happens in the meantime, and what systems needs to be in place? In the meantime, you can't, again, there's no such thing as fast healing. I know that we love to, we wish you well and we want to move you on to get to a place of healing because we love normalcy. Nevertheless, that's a danger, especially in today's climate and what we're talking about now. A new world way, a new world living, because what's done here will affect every spot of the world. But what the systems that have to be in play, number one, is the space of us being able to hold the powers that be accountable. That is a new system that we have never had in play. And in order to hold accountable, that means there's going to have to be resources put back in play. Money does not heal everything, everything. But however, we need spaces put in place for our people to be healed, which is going to require dollars. And so that is a very heavy question to ask. And I'm going to even have to chew on that. And I'm processing that even as I am responding. Because unfortunately, time is not on our side. But nevertheless, we know that it's going to take time in order to get what we have yet seen happen and come to pass. The new systems that will be built requires us digging up old wells, old systems, allowing the voiceless to be heard. And so, yeah, that is a very reflective time that I'm really going to have to say loud right now and just pause and reflect on what that looks like.
Well, thank you, Ms. Carmen. I think the way I would respond to this question is that it takes no time at all, and it takes all the time in the world. It's a both and. We live in a capitalist society, which means things work by supply and demand. So if we stop demanding the resources of the policing system and structure, they can't justify their budget. They can't justify spending all the resources if the communities are not utilizing those resources. Every year, people do a budget review in every company. When I worked in a university, every year we had to do a budget review, and they would look to say, okay, how much did you spend? Everyone was just like trying to spend all their money in the last month so they could get the same amount of budget for the following year. But the reality is, if there are departments within the police that are not spending and utilizing those resources because there is no demand, that's actually going to naturally force budget cuts, because they're going to be aware that there's no economic obligation to that, and that money needs to be spent in other places. So part of it is about how we start as citizens of Minneapolis to imagine, as Carmen is saying, differently, the kinds of resources, and educate ourselves on the kinds of resources that exist outside of calling 911. I think it's easy to call 911 and ask for them to respond to a particular situation. But what happens if we decide to slow down, assess the situation in the moment, and say, is there an alternative to calling 911? Who else can I reach out to? Who else can I bring into this circumstance. And there are hotlines that exist for mental health resources. There are hotlines that exist that are not the police that will kind of respond. And what we're looking at in George Floyd Square is by building a community safety team. Are they perfect? Absolutely not, but they respond. They will show up, they will assess the situation and decide what is the best thing to do. Do we walk the person out of our community? Do we talk to them? Is it a situation where we actually do need to call the police in? Or is it a situation where we have them call a family member or a relative and say, come get your people? There have been different kinds of responses to different kinds of threats in the square, but all being navigated by community volunteers. And so what we like to say is that we are imagining a world beyond policing, knowing that policing currently exists and that that is currently people's jobs and vocations. And so we don't want to deny that reality for some folks, but we also recognize that those systems aren't working for us. And so we have to start building something different. And we're learning as we go. As Ms. Carmen said, it's like we are building and fixing the bus while we're driving it. And so really trying to practice and learn through practice. What are our opportunities? We have brought in experts into the meetings on 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. We've brought in experts in mental health. We've brought in experts in de-escalation. We've brought in community organizing leaders. Ms. Carmen has shown up and talked to the groups. Pastors have showed up and talked to the community just to help us learn what resources and tools are out there other than calling the police that we can begin to utilize as a community. So that's why I say it takes no time at all. It really just takes a decision and a commitment to say, I'm going to try and live into this imagination of living into authentic community. And I don't like to use the term radical community, but I think it's what it is, being neighbors to one another again. But it does take all the time in the world, because as Ms. Carmen mentioned, that there is healing that needs to take place. There is deep pain, there's trauma. There are issues where people get triggered and they may respond and react. And then somebody else may respond and react to them responding and reacting. And we have to allow time for each other to heal. When it comes to healing, it takes as much time as it takes. And we have to give ourselves grace for that. If we freeze and say, oh my gosh, this is not working, we need to call the police again, we're doing ourselves no favors. So what does it look like to actually take the time? Maybe that means in order for us to do this, that everybody needs to be getting therapists to be able to process what it is that we are experiencing in our own bodies, that we are experiencing in our own traumas and our own feelings as we're working this new kind of way of community out. But it's worth trying. Because if it means that we all get to thrive and rise together, we all get to be healthy, we all get to be well, someday, that's the hope, that's the vision, then I think it's worth all of us trying together. But it does take all of us. It takes all the commitment. The moment one person digs their feet in the ground and says, nope, I'm not going, that creates the disunity and the distrust, and we have to work through that. So if someone were to do that in the context of the community I'm in, I would go and talk to them and say, what's behind it? What's behind digging your heels in the ground? What are the fears? What are the concerns? They're real, they're genuine. How do we navigate it together in community? How do we talk it out? And how do we work it out so that we're really focusing on the health and wellness of everybody, even those who are offended, or even those who don't understand, or even those who may be afraid. I think that's the best response I can give in this moment. It takes no time at all to make a decision to walk in a different direction. But it's going to take all the time in the world to actually walk it out and live it out and work through the kinks of building community.
Listen, everyone, we have 15 minutes left. I definitely want to say thank you to Carmen and Janelle. They're not going anywhere. I am just simply trying to transition us now to some of the questions that participants have provided us to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to. Certainly, I just want to try to create this space that acknowledge that there's likely some people, Carmen and Janelle, who feel really freed or inspired by what you've shared. And then there's some likely that might still have a lot of anxiety or feel like there's a lot of unanswered questions. This is just me saying that I think what's wonderful is that that's okay. Again, for people who joined late, we're not trying to sell anybody on anything. Your views are yours to hold and to own. It feels like many of the key themes toward the end for Janelle and Carmen was that there is no magic answer to the question or part of the question that I asked about timing. And there's not a magic response related to what should we do in the meantime, okay? I just want to acknowledge that because everybody is at different places in this dialogue and that is 100% okay. So one of the first questions that came up that Grace has shared is what specific, and I do want to say that our panelists may not be able to respond specifically to each of these questions. They just may not have either a point of view or the insight to share. What specific outcomes have different communities, neighborhoods in the Twin Cities been calling for? So Reclaim the Block has been one of the most vocal groups, but I have not heard how many people agree with their platform and how many other ideas. I understand if you can only speak for your own groups or communities. So again, I think really the crux of that question, Carmen and Janelle, is are you hearing or do you know of other communities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, adjacent suburbs or other places that have other thoughts and specific outcomes as it relates to some of these ideas of defunding or abolishing?
Just real quickly, I'll respond to what I've heard. I know there are organizations that are for defund the police, like the Black Visions Collective. I know there are organizations for abolish the police. I know there are organizations for back the blue. I know we've tried police reform in different ways. If you remember, like 2016, a huge push on a national scale with body cameras and police bias trainings. Those are methods of trying to reform policing. I think what we're doing in George Floyd Square is more so focusing on what are we trying to move toward, as opposed to what are we trying to run away from. But that's my very limited response to say, yes, there are other organizations that take a stance, a more hard stance on each of these issues. But where I'm at is focusing on community.
Thank you.
And the same here, piggybacking off of what Janelle have just said, there is, being in the community and talking to the community, there are multiple answers. There's multiple, I mean, countless to be honest. There's a lot of people have different views. What I do hear constantly, more I should say, and there is no, I'm gonna say just one monolithic way of looking at this, as far as there are definitely very diverse views. Some people are, the whole thought of abolishing makes them literally enemies with BBC. That's that's scary for them. That's unheard of. What do you mean? And so with that, what I am hearing is the common thread of we cannot continue the same. And even though the other side of that statement may not lead to abolishing is the answer, that is at least the opening space that is needed to begin to flirt with or imagine with and at least reconcile with yourself. Well, then what's the next question? What is the answer? It's no way that you could have seen the footage that we have seen and what we are witnessing, and for most people, and just be okay with that. And that has came from all different walks of life. What is the answer if abolishing is not it? So I do want to say this too. One of the things that I want to make sure that's very clear and that I appreciate for this panel is that there's room for differences. There's rooms for different thinking. There's room for different imagination. Everyone is not going to have the whole defunding and abolishing type of goal. Some people are okay with this because really, to be honest, it's not a problem until it becomes your problem. And so you can see yourself as being George Floyd, or you can see your loved ones or someone, anybody that you know, there's not a connection to the situation. It's not your situation. But even in this world, it's okay to have that. But one thing that I know that the constant thing that I even hear from our elders is we cannot continue the same. We cannot have the police show up the same. But the other piece of that is, and neither can the community be the same. So there's a answer to both that I'm hearing constantly, more constant than not.
Thank you, Carmen. So I'm going to go to the next question here. And then Grace, just so you know, I see you in the chat. I will be responding shortly to your specific question. But the second question, so Janelle and Carmen can respond to as we're at the 10-minute out mark or just under, what kind of resources should be available when educating the public about safety, in your opinions? So again, I'll repeat, what kind of resources should be available when educating the public about safety, in your opinions?
I think one of the issues that I've struggled with this summer is the attempt of the city to divorce safety from justice, and to say that somehow we can somehow still have safety without actually bringing justice into a situation. But I actually believe that justice brings safety. And so in order for us to understand safety, I think we actually have to have resources to know what are the systemic inequities and the systemic injustices that are actually happening in our community, that are causing the injustices that are causing harm to other people, that may then trigger them to cause harm to other people, which may trigger them to cause harm to other people, right? I think understanding the systems and how they're operating and working to the advantage of some and the disadvantage of others is essential for us to begin to understand how we think about safety and how we talk about safety. And then also to understand history and context. I'm a huge context person. Understand the history and context of safety in Minneapolis and how our systems were created, how they evolved, the data, who they police, who they don't police, and then being able to ask questions and get those documented as well in terms of the responses of city officials and city leaders as to why are you policing or patrolling those particular areas. I also think it's in terms of equity and economics, it's also important to understand in those constructs of policing and safety that currently exist, who's getting paid how much and why, and what departments are underfunded and why, and to understand when we think of these systems of safety, are they holistically safe for everybody? Because then as community members, as voters, as taxpayers, we can begin to make educated decisions in terms of what is safety. And is what I thought is safety still safe? Not just for me, but for everybody.
Thank you, Janelle. And again, just a run-on sentence from what she said, because everything she said was so true. One of the things I think that we've definitely undervalued in our community, along with the resources that we know that that the city has not provided us with, we've undervalued the stories and the resources that are within our bodies, that's within our communal spaces. We've actually weakened them or made them cheap to think that it's only a resources attached to a dollar amount. Now let's be clear, there is dollars that is needed in order to run that, but that is not all that's needed. If indeed, again, we're talking about reimagining and the building of community, we first have to be able to and be willing to go down a dark path of historical context. You can't really talk about abolishing without talking about white supremacy, without talking about anti-racism, without talking about anti-blackness. You can't. The reason why policing shows up in certain community of colors, because we are very much so attached to an anti-black society that has pivoted black folks as criminals, brown folks as well. And so we have to be able to have those conversations. And those conversations, yes, we have the young people that come forth that has the head knowledge to do so. But I'm a stickler in believing what happens when the elders speak about that from a place of experience and not from a place of textbook. That's a different, it's a difference to talk about what 35 did going through B&O versus you being a homeowner in that area at that time. It's a difference. And I think a lot of times, especially in our community, and what this has taught us is the power of the voice. Again, being diverse from our elders as well as our youth. But one of those main resources needing the voice being rekindled inside of our elders' beings, to be rekindled as them being deemed leaders in our community without the approval of the city. Those are things that have gotten us through for generations to come, from plantations up to now. Stories, and not just stories as far as fables, but stories of overcoming. Those are things that need to be in our community, along with resources that should already been there. We have not talked about the 24 demands, but really the 24 demands were nothing less, nothing more of resources that are allocated to our community, but not given to our community. And so if we go down that long, slippery slope that we must go on, and we're talking about the building of community, which leads to healthy abolishing, we have to talk about why the resources were not put here. We have to talk about supremacy in every area. And we have to talk about how do we undo, once again, the harm that has been caused, the trauma that has been caused, and the why it even exists. That's a hard pill to swallow, but we have to talk about the why it exists.
Thank you both. So listen, we are 3 minutes out. I want to, it doesn't seem like I have any other questions from Grace in the chat, but I will ask for Janelle and Carmen, if you can kind of briefly begin to think about some closing comments around this idea. So based on what you've shared and your views personally, oh, wait a minute, there are a number of other, oh, you put them in the spreadsheet, Grace, is that right?
In the document, yeah, but I can start copying and pasting them over. I do think we have significantly more questions than we'll be able to get to in our remaining time. So just want to note that, and perhaps we can, find a way to provide visibility to the questions that we weren't able to answer tonight, and look to continue the conversation through additional resources and stuff.
Grace, if you see the spreadsheet, then can I just ask you to go ahead and read the last question or the next question that came into the queue for Carmen and Janelle, and then we will wrap up after that. And just Carmen and Janelle, be mindful that we're at 6:58.
All right, everyone. So the last question is, somebody said, I'm not sure if this can be answered in this space, but wondering why Minneapolis residents can't call 911 and request medical only, no police. I speak from personal experience. That was the next question.
Yes, I actually learned from someone who works in the mental health field recently this summer, because we actually had the same question, is that when someone calls for an ambulance, that the ambulance comes with a police escort, because there is a certain paperwork in a document that the police actually have to fill out in order to allow that ambulance then to take that person and transport them. And so there is a relationship between the police and EMS with paperwork involved. I don't understand it all. It still confuses me why that is. But then also that EMS can request a police escort as well, if for some reason that the driver feels like that they need a police escort to go in a particular circumstance. But when transporting someone, the police have to sign off on that.
Amen.
Okay, so that's, I think, Carmen's version of ditto, and we appreciate that. Listen, Carmen and Janelle are wonderful, and we so deeply appreciate them as panelists. What I am going to do, there are relationships here, so I am confident that we will be able to get them to provide us some brief written responses, not overnight, to some of the other questions that were left in the queue. We want to honor the fact that we didn't get to all of the questions that people asked. I see head nods, and so we will be able to do that because I know that every question is important. This is a first of a series, everybody. We are not turning a blind eye to even those who are really supportive of reform. We're just trying to help each of us to become more aware and educated about what these words mean so that no one person or entity makes us fearful of any one of these words. And we stay focused on what our vision is for the collective community's good. And I believe that tonight's conversation, thanks to Carmen Means and Janelle Austin, was a step toward that. Again, we think highly of the video that the Reclaim the Block representative shared, in the spirit of it's very informative, very clear, not really trying to sell you on one ideology. It creates a very clear narrative around the difference between reform, defund, and abolish. So if you have an opportunity to review it, we would encourage you to do so. Everyone, we thank you deeply for your participation. Janelle and Carmen, you have PPNAs and the boards and the staffs and the community's undying support for simply saying yes, adding your voice to this space in a very constructive and powerful way. We appreciate you, we see you, we care deeply for your strength and everything that you're continuing to do in service of people in this community. We wish everyone a very wonderful night. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.